preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Annette Insdorf, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our evening on war in film. The Story of G.I. Joe is a film of 1945 that conveys with immediacy the reality of war. It's based on the reporting of Ernie Pyle, who had experienced combat at first hand, and it includes in the cast approximately 150 combat veterans who were essentially playing variations of their own experience. In following an infantry unit in battle and at rest, this film gives cinematic life to Ernie Pyle's newspaper columns, and in a manner that's not really typical of Hollywood. There are no violent climaxes, melodramatic cliches, histrionic acting, little romances on the side. Rather, as the great critic James Agee pointed out, the style of this film is original, keen, dry, spare, and reminiscent of Ernest Hemingway's style. The film was directed by William Wellman, who had been himself a flyer in World War I, and he had to be seduced, courted, etc. by the producer in order to make this film because he claimed that he hated the infantry and wanted nothing to do with it. It was only when Ernie Pyle recounted the story himself to Wellman that he finally broke down and agreed to direct the film. To prepare the actors for the parts, he had them train with regular soldiers and live with them, and the result is what James Agee called a war poem as great as anything by Walt Whitman, and the first really triumphant attempt to combine fiction and documentary film. And now the story of G.I. Joe. Good evening, and good evening again to those of you who are here for the story of G.I. Joe. I'm Annette Insdorf, and I'm happy to welcome you to our screening of Paths of Glory, and particularly happy that our guest speaker tonight is Terrence Des Pres, author of The Survivor, whom you'll meet after the screening for our discussion. Paths of Glory was directed in 1957 by Stanley Kubrick, who would go on to make such films as 2001: A Space Odyssey, Dr. Strangelove, A Clockwork Orange, and Barry Lyndon. These are all very unique films, but I think that they share with Paths of Glory a concern with dehumanization and a rich, dramatic visual style. Kubrick had read the novel Paths of Glory by Humphrey Cobb, which is based on a true incident in World War I. He decided to make the film, but no studio would take a chance unless a star played the lead. Kirk Douglas entered the scene, and the picture was made. They had to shoot the film in Germany, partly because the negative depiction of the French ruled out French locations. And when the film came out, something very interesting happened. At least as of a few years ago, Paths of Glory was still banned in France. When the film was first released, Switzerland banned it out of respect for the French, and it wasn't until 1970 that the film was shown in Switzerland. And moreover, Paths of Glory was originally banned in US military establishments. Kubrick's decision to cast Adolphe Menjou as General Brulard adds another level of resonance to the film because of Menjou's extreme right-wing sympathies, both on-screen and off. Menjou was one of the actors who had named names for Joe McCarthy, and his testimony extended the line of reasoning that he gives in Paths of Glory as General Brulard, namely that troops, like children, need discipline, that examples must be set, that individuals are expendable for an honorable, i.e. patriotic cause. This film is important not only because of its vision of war, it's also a magnificent example of formal inventiveness in film language. You might notice the high contrast lighting, the camera tracking inexorably through the trenches, the composition of shots, which suggest always that human beings are dwarfed by formal symmetry. Now, these formal aspects are important because they're inseparable from the moral and emotional elements of the material. If Kubrick invites an awareness of symmetry, it's because the film depicts a world in which morality has yielded to forms, in which individuals are less significant than order, and in which compassion has given way to systematic exploitation. And now for a gripping vision of World War I, Paths of Glory. I hope that you'll permit me to be a little bit personal in my introduction of tonight's guest speaker, because I find it hard to be objective or distanced about Terrence Des Pres. The fact is that he's been the most not only influential but inspirational person in my own work, because I decided to write a book on film and the Holocaust only after having read his book, The Survivor, An Anatomy of Life in the Death Camps. This remarkable book, which treats the possibilities for not only physical but moral survival in both the Nazi death camps and the Stalinist death camps, struck me very deeply, because I heard a voice that I somehow identified with or wanted to emulate. It was the voice of a scholar, because, I mean, after all, Terrence Des Pres is a professor of English at Colgate University. He was trying to talk about literary texts that came out of the Holocaust, but what came through in the book is a tone of moral urgency, which is very rare for a scholar these days. And then I started to read his other work and hear his lectures. I read his film reviews in Harper's and The Nation, where he indeed tackled the difficult and thorny films like Seven Beauties and The Memory of Justice. I heard him lecture about the literature that came out of the Vietnam War. And then I knew that he became part of the President's Holocaust Commission. And I know that he's now writing a book that should be very important to all of us on poetry and politics. Please join me in welcoming Terrence Des Pres.
Thank you, dear. Yes, thanks.
It's okay. Well, this evening, those of us who were here for both films saw two approaches to war on film, one kind of idealizing in the story of G.I. Joe, and one that had a kind of bitter irony in Paths of Glory. Are these the main approaches to the war in art and film? Are there other approaches that these have nothing to do with? I mean, what do they fit into?
Both these approaches were very, very highly structured. And I think they were created as opposed to the kind of thing we would get if we were watching to a documentary. Those of you who saw G.I. Joe know that the approach there, which gave it its kind of romantic resonance and kind of idealistic spirit, was that that film really captured a collective, many men working together in a place which was demonic. They're in hell, but they all got along together. No strife among them, even against their officers, certainly not between each other. This film, this remarkably powerful film, I hadn't seen it in a long time. My God, it's powerful. This film clearly got at war, which is almost something you can't get at, by selecting a significant event, a small, tiny event, through which the whole radical injustice and terror of war could be filtered. And of course, this is much more powerful. When you get at the terror, we didn't have any of that in G.I. Joe.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, that in both films, we don't really see the enemy. And is that typical? I mean, what does one make of a war film where you can't even see an enemy?
Well, I had forgotten this film, but when I was studying Vietnam War fiction, you never see the enemy. You see the tunnels, you see dead bodies, but you never see the enemy active. The bombs blow up, booby traps blow up, but you never see them. They're hiding in the woods somewhere, the jungle somewhere. But clearly, here we saw two films tonight. We saw the enemy in G.I. Joe, very stylized, up in a bell tower, very symbolic. When he's shot down, he falls upon an angel which breaks and falls with him. But we didn't see much of the enemy. We saw no enemy in this. I think it has a lot to do with war as an experience in the self as opposed to war as something you do in the world. And that has to do with the feeling of helplessness, that war is so big, modern war, that there's nothing we can do except experience it. And in Kubrick's film, clearly, you're dehumanized by it. Almost everybody's dehumanized. Did you notice, for example, the way they crawled across no man's land? They looked like insects, or the reference to herding together, or the ant hill, or finally that magnificent scene, got the edge on him now. They're going to be like that cockroach any minute. That was a wonderful little symbolic scene. There's that, and then it seems to me that our perception of war in the last 100 years, well, it's radically altered. I really believe we can say this, and not only that, but that war is one of the central experiences of our century, and probably maybe the defining experience of the century. Not that we're all in war, but that the image of it, the terror of it, hovers before us, quite apart from nuclear threat, which of course intensifies it all. But if you go back and think about, naturally we have to go back before film, how Stendhal or, say, Tolstoy would represent war. War was just something. It was one other aspect of human experience. In fact, it was an act of God or an act of nature. In War and Peace, in the Battle of, I think, the Borodino, when Pierre is wandering, he wanders right through the battlefield. Here's just anyone wandering through a battlefield. War encircles it as if it were simply the environment, but an environment that's understandable because it's one of the things that happens. Now, something very interesting occurs when we move into the 20th century, and this happened with the First World War in actual fact. The people experiencing war began to see that it wasn't an act of God, that it wasn't an act of nature, that it was an act of men, and that it was a political outcome of many, strategies, of many wills, of many desires. And it comes to focus first in the First World War, and it's important that this film is about the First World War that we just saw. It comes to focus in the anger and resentment and outright hatred that the ordinary troops feel for their officers. And this is well documented. There's tremendous animosity, a tremendous hostility between ordinary soldiers and the officers. Not necessarily the highest officers, but of course, since it's a hierarchy, any officer tends to represent all the others. Partly this was due, say, for the Americans in Vietnam, this occurred, yes, the fragging business and stuff like that when officers demanded things that were suicidal. But in the First World War, it had a lot to do with class, education. The officers were educated class, moneyed, etc., and they kept themselves fairly safe while the men were being blown to bits. And in any case, there's several good books that document this, but that's really not the point I want to make, although it's very strongly a part of the film we just saw, Paths of Glory. And indeed, the cynicism of these officers is like everything else in the film, very not so subtly exaggerated. The exaggeration is a mode in this film, but more subtly, I think. In fact, I thought at first it was strictly a realistic film. I began to notice that the voices are magnified in distorted ways and things like that. But the conflict between the officers and the enlisted men points up the perception on the fact, on the part of the soldiers, that they are trapped in a world run by other men. So it's not just war anymore. It's war plus people that are supposed to be your friends who are not your friends, which of course is a definition of politics if you want to push us that far. Now, there is a third, I think, perception of war, which arises from seeing it as caused by human beings, but goes beyond it. But I won't say it transcends, because it maybe subscends, or whatever that word would be. It becomes demonic. The whole world of war becomes a place which of course has officers in it who are rather monstrous and cynical, but beyond that, it is a place where everyone who enters into it is infected by it to some degree, and only the saints, or the heroes in this case, Kirk Douglas, can endure without being tainted beyond repair. Those at least seem to be three possible stages of.
It also makes sense in terms of Kubrick's own development. I mean, after making Paths of Glory, he makes Dr. Strangelove, almost as if telling us that you can still be an idealist like Dax in that period of World War I, but by the time you get beyond that, the only response to the moral bankruptcy is a kind of savage satire, and that's where he went afterwards. Do you find that a film like, let's say, Dr. Strangelove, or let's say Seven Beauties, to take a World War II example, that the kind of black humor, the stylization, the satire, is that as appropriate or more appropriate to the horror of war, to depicting that as, let's say, a sober record of a war, G.I. Joe maybe, or a documentary? I mean, is one more authentic than another, more useful than another, more appropriate?
Well, we're sort of talking in threes tonight: the documentary, straight realism, and then stylized presentations. I've for a long time been hung up on the power of documentary. Certainly when you get into something like the concentration camps, I have never seen a film which could just present the blunt, brutal horror of the camps the way something like Night and Fog, Renee's film, could. And therefore, when one comes to extreme forms of experience that seem to transcend the capacity of the individual to understand them, documentary seems awfully tempting as a first introduction and as a final comment. But clearly, if we just face it that way, we have no understanding. And for a long time, till tonight perhaps, I thought that films like Seven Beauties may, in their inventiveness and in their distortions, calculated strategic distortions, be a way of capturing that horror. But I must say, I've never been so moved and so almost devastated in a spiritual sense by Seven Beauties or any other film I can think of compared to this film. Just one point about this film. The psychological structure is extraordinary. Quite apart from the cynicism angle, the charge when they charge the anthill, that is pretty, as my son would say, gross. And the power of that then spills over into the anger of the men and distorts everything they do, including their voices, and jars so radically with the palace that they dance in, and they have the but the other thing, it somehow is under the prison scene. The prison scene, I notice, is the only scene which is deliberately muted when the glare and the heart. This is hard-edged realism here, but the realism cuts down. I'm talking about the visual aspect. It cuts down the prison scene. It's almost religious, not quite. Yeah. But the horror is there. It's underneath. I feel it the whole time, and it just builds. And you know they're going to die. If you've seen the film before, the first time I saw it, I knew they were going to die. And that's one of the beauties of straightforward acting, the beginning, the middle, and the end, as Aristotle said, because you have then a strategy of doom, and you don't have any flashbacks, any montage. You just go straight through, and that horror just accumulates. And it's very moving, very powerful.
I'd also like to open this a bit to the people in the audience, if you have some questions or comments that you'd like to raise at this point. Yes?
Why was the film not shown in France or France?
Why was the film not shown in France? Apparently, it was banned by the French authorities because of the extremely negative depiction of the French military in World War I. That's the simple explanation given in texts about it. And that's why, of course, they would not let them shoot the film in France. They shot it in Germany.
Which is kind of ironic, huh?
Yeah, it's part of the kind of irony we come to associate with Kubrick, who now, by the way, after making a film like this, resides in England and makes films like Barry Lyndon. Yes?
There was a line in the film which indicated the officer's mentality. It was something about sometimes you need an execution to keep men in line. In June 1953, Dean Loomer of Chicago University and two other clergymen representing, I think, thousands of clergymen, saw President Eisenhower asking him to intervene to stay the execution of Elizabeth Rosenberg. And President Eisenhower's comment was, "I remember from my army days, sometimes we need an execution to cool off the men in the trenches." Now, he was referring to Private Slovak, so Private Slovak was executed. And of course, doesn't cool off the men in the trenches. And of course, hasn't cooled off the people who have studied the Rosenberg case. So that now the FBI files reveal the truths unearthed by researchers over a 30-year period. And if anyone is interested, I have a bibliography of books on the case. And our interest in the case, those of us who have become almost obsessed with it, the small people like myself, and the people more respected like Dr. Einstein and Dr. Urey, whose interest was not academic, but who worked very hard and spent lots of time in publicizing that. The interest started with the record, you see, and then it became an emotional thing.
Well, let's not stray too far from the execution then, but
that was Eisenhower.
that's a good point. In the film, this film we saw tonight, it's stated ironically. We were going to get to the exact opposite, but ritual executions don't relieve attention; they implicate. I suppose that Eisenhower didn't know what he was getting himself into, and no one who would have a public execution so drawn out would. Of course it disturbs people. Of course it makes people feel guilty. That's what this film is intended to do when you watch it. And it probably is, well, it does for us now. This is an interesting thing about films, Annette. We were talking earlier about the remarkable, I always called it, the other film, G.I. Joe, a sort of demonic idol or demonic pastoral, because everything, they're getting killed all the time, you know, but amongst themselves, everything is great. And Annette said, well, yes, but remember, it was 1945. This is an American film. We've just gotten out of the war. There's a need to endorse the image of ourselves, which is quite well done, actually. But nevertheless, it's an endorsement rather than a disclosure of ourselves. And, no, damn it. What was I going to? Oh, yes. The point being that that's 1945, but how can you see that film that way anymore? Because when you endorse rather than disclose, you are doctoring, you are producing propaganda. We would say now, certainly after the Second World War and after Vietnam and after Korean War and God knows what's going on right now, El Salvador, you name it. It's very hard to see these things historically. In fact, you have to make an effort, you have to teach it that way, because we're not going to do it. And I'm not sure that when we sit in an auditorium, we need to do it. We need to pull all our feeling about war into what's in front of our face, and that's fine. But again, of course, the real meaning of it for the director at the time needs to be preserved. But clearly, Kubrick, it means to indict, right? Not just the French or whomever he uses as his example, but in fact, all mankind that indulges in war. So.
And incidentally, to extend your comment, next Wednesday we will indeed be showing 2 films about the Rosenberg case. But just for right now, it is interesting that Paths of Glory has to be understood as a film of 1957, indeed that it was made after the McCarthy trials. Indeed, I mentioned the whole thing about Adolphe Menjou before the film because I think there is a connection. And a film like G.I. Joe exists in terms of 1945. And yet, Paths of Glory, because it has the distance of World War I, takes on a kind of timeless quality. It's not about the French and the Germans. I forget that about midway through the film. It's about class struggle, too, and that's where I think you said, too, the political problem is precisely that the paths of glory are not the roads between nations, but the roads of ambition within the nations, the hierarchy that you mentioned, the very fact that there is a hierarchy and a general can decide who dies, that's what the film is so powerful in projecting today as well.
Yeah, what about that ending? I had forgotten that. Who, and this is an important question, I think, who are those soldiers weeping for at the end? For that poor girl? For themselves? For everyone? I mean, clearly we don't know. I mean, it's ambiguous on purpose. It could be everyone. It could be this larger perception got by going through the war that there's something really radically flawed with the human condition as we have it now, when men are so at each other's throats, both army against army and then within the ranks, upper against lower. There seems to be some kind of tragic perception at that point.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that a lot of people can think about after the film. If you want to choose to see Kubrick as a cynic, then that last scene, which has the music of her lullaby becoming a march, can fulfill your feeling that everything will be regimented again. But those of you who want to have faith in the human race can believe that the tears liberate something human because a song, a work of art has, released that in them. Sir?
Was ordered, and a lot more men were going to lose their lives for nothing, a lot more than even those 3 men. And in the beginning of the battle, and Kirk Douglas was going to carry out that order unquestioningly and send himself and a lot of his soldiers to death. In the beginning, when they announced the objective of taking the anvil, they said, what's an acceptable casualty figure? Well, maybe 65%. And again, without discussing, and never is it discussed, what the objective is necessary, or the amount of casualties. Everybody, just focuses on the death of 2 or 3 people. And like they said in the film, we're not so much afraid to die, we are afraid of pain. And we as the audience, and even Kirk Douglas, is not so much afraid of seeing every one of those men with a story get killed anonymously. It's just when they see the people get squashed. And I think that's the danger also.
What you just said made me alert to something I was disturbed about watching this film. I didn't realize what it was till just now. Kirk Douglas is in an impossible position. I mean, he has to carry out the orders, but he has to be the just man also. And I was put off by that outburst after the men are dead, right? Why doesn't he have an outburst before they die? Because maybe that would have caused trouble? But the film wouldn't have worked, obviously. And it was rather psychologically fulfilling that someone finally told that guy to go to hell. But nevertheless, it was a futile statement. I suppose Kubrick wanted it to be futile. Everything is futile. The paths of glory lead but to the grave.
True. And also, I think one also has to see Dax as the mediating figure. That's what makes him so interesting. He exists midway between the trenches and the chateau, between the generals and the men who have to die. And it's in that precarious position, in limbo, that he takes on meaning through identification that we can bring to it.
I think your comment about tears is very crucial to his film. And I think Kubrick uses the symbol, he uses tears very symbolically. And it really ushers in a transformation of instinct, if you will. Because the tears, the fact that a man can cry is what distinguishes him from the cockroach. And tears really do have a way of neutralizing aggression and humanizing.
Well, we saw that most dramatically. Those men in that bar, or bistro, whatever it was, were animals. And they were full of anger and lust, you name it. And then this woman starts singing, and they calm down. They become human for a second again. But as someone else said, perhaps you, they're not going to be around to be human very long. I mean, how much humanity is going to survive is up for
Or if you want to be
doubt.
really cynical about it, what about our own tears after seeing a film like this? I mean, is it merely a cathartic thing? We cry for a few seconds and then conveniently forget about it? Or do the tears contain some kind of possibility for something afterwards? I mean, that's implicit there, too.
This is a gentleman there.
Yeah, sorry.
This is the first time I've seen the film, but somehow it reminds me of two Australian films, Break Morant and Gallipoli. Break Morant deals with the trumped-up court-martial, and Gallipoli deals with men jumping into suicide. I was wondering if you influence of...
Yeah, the question is that the question is, that this film reminds the gentleman of that there are two other films that have come out from Australia, Gallipoli and Breaker Morant, which this film seems to precede and perhaps influence. Breaker Morant about a trumped-up court-martial charge, and Gallipoli about the men in World War I jumping in and out of trenches in a suicidal mission. Do you want to talk about this?
I only saw Breaker Morant, so I don't know.
The only thing I can say is I interviewed the director of Breaker Morant, Bruce Beresford, and asked him precisely this question. And he sort of didn't want to call Paths of Glory an influence on Breaker Morant because Breaker Morant happens to be an actual incident in Australian history. And there really was a case like that during the Boer War. There was a play that was written about it and performed in Australia, and only then was the film made. So Beresford himself sort of held out for the uniqueness of that particular film. Yes?
I'd like to point out that you asked a question or made a statement about what are our feelings after seeing a film like this. Well, my feelings are that war is an abomination, and if we could in any way do away with war, and yet I feel completely helpless. You said, what are we going to do? I am completely helpless in the face of anything like this.
You're not completely helpless. You can join any of 100 or 200 organizations. You can write your congressman. You can be part of the peace marches. They do have some effect. We did stop the Vietnam War. Things can get better. Possibly not, but we can try. That's why I say to my students all the time, and I have this in the image of the cockroach in the back of my mind. Now I realize this, that it's there. This film is there. It's an amazing film. And
Yes?
I had a different view of the...
No, I'm sorry. I was calling on the one behind you because you had spoken already. I'm sorry. Yes?
I was wondering about your idea at the end of the film, the men crying because the Fraulein was singing and she was crying. Could it be because she also was a prisoner and she was full of trepidation and fear, but in order to survive, even though she didn't want to be there, she had to perform, just as the men also were full of trepidation and fear, but in order to survive, they also had to perform by fighting in a war.
Did you hear that? The possibility? Do you want to have a comment on that?
it's true that clearly this young woman, she's not a prisoner of war, but she has no circumstances, I suppose, in which to support herself. Perhaps her family is dead. If she wants to eat, she's going to sing, which is not by far the worst thing the Germans had to do, or the French for that matter, when they were occupied. And it's right, she's caught like they are. The difference is she probably won't be killed now, and they probably will. But there is some kind of fellow feeling that transcends, it seems to me, the particular situation, as if suddenly these men, perhaps with the catalyst of the young woman and her pain and fear, suddenly saw this infinitely suffering thing at the heart of all existence. That's the feeling I get about it, anyhow. But it starts with some kind of actual situation, which is the woman.
And I think, I'm not sure if I'm right, but that the song she sings is some kind of a lullaby, if I'm not mistaken. Someone told me that it was a German song that one sings to a child. And almost like in Story of G.I. Joe, where the whole kind of recurring thing of the soldier wanting so badly to hear a little record that his wife has sent of his son saying Dada. I mean, the whole idea, the importance of the image of the child, of a certain innocence, perhaps, is what might be informing the ending.
This lady.
Sorry. No, did you want to
Well,
answer
I just
that?
want to say one thing. That it just reminded me that G.I. Joe paints a war heroically, and for instance, when you have to have a significant death, these men's death was significant because they were utterly meaningless, and that becomes significant within the framework of the film. The three in Paths of Glory, and at the end of G.I. Joe, just at the end, the captain, who's loved by all his men, he loves all his men, is killed, and of course he's not a mark on him, and his face is clean, and he's laid out something like Che Guevara, and he's great dignity to the whole thing, and. There, it's just a film about men at war from the point of view of compassion. Ernie Pyle's wandering around feeling sad for these guys, which is understandable. And therefore, it's enough if it's an entirely secular film, which it is. No references to anything but men at war. Now, this film seems to me to go beyond itself, to become metaphysical, to suggest all kinds of things about the nature of existence. And yet, if you will assume that the priest is just one more character in the film and no focal point and no perspective, then this film stays entirely within the realm of the secular. And that's rather odd, especially for Kubrick, who sometimes wants to stray beyond that realm, most disastrously in that Shining film. But isn't Paths of Glory strange for that reason? Because it does suggest something quite a bit deeper or beyond itself without ever declaring it. Maybe that's the power of any good film, I suppose. But there really isn't any transcendent dimension to this film.
Yeah, I guess that's just the point. That's why there are so many
You really feel
interpretations
trapped
of
by
the
it.
end. Yeah.
Lady.
I took it to mean, when you compare this movie to Prevalence, that there wasn't any such incident as in Australia that happened in France.
I'm sorry, no, there was. Paths of Glory is based on a novel by Humphrey Cobb, which is about a true incident during World War I.
That really happened in France.
Yes.
Well, the comparison between the first movie, the Story of G.I. Joe, and this one, the Americans are pictured as this wonderful hero, fair-hearted, justice-minded, fighting a fair war, and that's the problem with Americans. They think war is wonderful and heroic, and the French would do something like that, not us. And that's the way it is.
Well, one comment, one loose separation. It's across the board in literature, at least, in French literature, German literature, American literature, and English literature. The First World War was a very cynical war. Everyone, rather, no one knew what we were fighting for, what anybody was fighting for. It was bogged down in the trenches, and it was meaningless slaughter. Everybody had that perception. Now, the Second World War seemed to be different because it was an ideological war. We had a true enemy in Hitler. He was, after all, attacking. This is how it seemed, and it's been the Second World War that sort of governed our imagination since, I believe. It's even certainly overshadowed the Korean War, and it tried to overshadow the Vietnam War. I don't know how much it succeeded, but it seemed to be what's called a just war. And we entered late. We were sort of clean, and there probably wasn't a sort of an element of the clean good guy as the way we perceived ourselves getting in there. But anyway, those two wars were very different in the way they were perceived.
Sir, in the middle.
In Paths of Glory, there is more than a suggestion of the class distinction between the officers and the men. Their lifestyle, their social life, their ambitions, which is not present in the first film, where you get a picture of a democratic army with the officers and the men having much more in common, no class differences or distinction. I think Paths of Glory has that element. It's not emphasized, but it may relate to the two different types of war. One was a just war, the other was a war which did not have the elements of the ideology that we were seeing in the second World War.
Yeah, the nastiness of the officers in Paths of Glory has a lot to do with their frustration. They're not going anywhere. You know, they're not winning that war, and they're very angry about that. I can see where that fellow who played
Adolphe Menchou.
well, the other one, you know,
Oh, General Miro.
would get that angry. I could understand his anger, although I wouldn't want to be in his shoes. Yeah.
Yes.
One comment about just and unjust wars. August Progressive, very interesting. There's an article on World War II and whether it was in fact a just war. I won't tell you what it says.
No, I'm just going to proceed.
I have a question for you that I would like to answer before I ask the second question. Do you feel that greed is possibly the greatest reason for war?
Greed?
Greed.
I don't know what the causes of war are totally, but I don't think greed is the central cause, no. Even if capitalism causes war, it's a necessity to keep the machine going. You got to spread out, you got to get more new resources, etc., if you want to look at it that way. That's not greed, that's necessity. The whole thing will collapse if you don't. In this particular film suggested there's something that when tormented, men become demonic, or they become dehumanized. The men in the trenches became dehumanized. The officers became almost satanic, but in a small way. You know, no grandiose kind of Hitler type thing. But no, it's not greed. It's I don't know. I was sort of. You look at a film like this, you begin to wonder if maybe what they taught me when I was a kid about original sin isn't true. You kind of hope it isn't, but it might be. And you had another question? Or, yeah.
If I can just add one word here, it seems too that we're forgetting the entire subplot of Lieutenant Roget, the guy who sends Paris off to be killed because he himself is guilty on a smaller scale of exactly what the generals are guilty of, namely of killing his own. And in his case, it's fear. And, you know, I just wanted to throw that out. I mean, fear that he will be discovered, fear that he will lose something. It's not so much greed as the insecurity of what he might lose, and that makes him do what he does, so for what that's worth.
How did you take Ralph Meeker's final comment to him? When he said, "I'm sorry," did he say okay, or what? He just shook his head. That was quite amazing. It was almost like Christ thinking, "I forgive them; they know not what they do," or something. Although that Christ thing was played down. I bring that up because in a lot of war stories, the people who were killed are given the image of Christ behind them. This wasn't.
Well, in this case, we only get the poor guy on the stretcher who can't help but look like the Christ figure.
But he's not in the middle.
No, luckily. In the back.
The role, the position of Kirk Douglas, was a more difficult one than some comments here seem to be suggesting. I think that he was in a situation where he was absolutely aghast and about what the officers, the top officers were doing, and was trying his very, very hardest to do well for his men. And someone made a comment about why didn't he make an outburst before they were killed. Well, I think he was trying to be as diplomatic as he could because he still thought he was in a position where he could perhaps wield some influence after having brought this very nasty news to Adolphe Menchou, and the way he kept looking at it, hoping against hope that he was going to stay in the execution at the very end. So I don't think that was really the correct way to assess what he was doing. And what I want to say more broadly about his role, I think that, to me at any rate, his position was being shown as, here is a person who is able to analyze and evaluate what is going on above as well as what is going on below. And he is caught in the middle. He wants to do his very best. He's the good one. And yet, powerless man against this machine which war or other events or situations in society puts people. How does one single individual manage to get some influence to turn things the way he can? It's extremely difficult, if not impossible. And I think that this was what Kubrick was trying to show.
I think that's perfectly said. It's certainly more penetrating than what I did say. I was talking only about maybe the psychological placement of the outburst. I mean, you're absolutely right. He's not going to blow up before he thinks he's exhausted all his resources. And I think you're right also in a larger sense that this man is trapped, and no matter what he does in this world, given the power of war and the power of that attack and the power of the carnage, he's not going to come out with any kind of victory. One wonders what will happen to that man. If he doesn't get killed, perhaps the best thing for him would get one of those woundless bullets through him. I mean, where can he go? What can he do? He would have to deal at every level with other officers. They would stomp him in a minute.
We have time for about one more question. On the aisle, please. A criminal attorney.
So he was not a professional officer, he was a civilian.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And he didn't have the military
Training.
mentality to start with, a military emotional structure to start with. So he really wasn't in this. The civilian bridge between the two levels.
Yes.
This is the first time I've seen it. I don't really know much about the film when it was released. Past the glory, probably not yet. Someone mentioned before that while you're watching the movie, you almost forget that it's the French army, that it could be any country. And it was banned in France, and I guess it was Sweden or Switzerland. I'm just curious as to how well it was received here, and if they had any problems distributing it or whatever when it was first released, do you know?
I'm not positive. I know that the project itself was received with great fear and trepidation by studios. As I mentioned, they refused to do the film unless a star played the lead. The idea being that they had some sort of sanction or bankability with difficult material if indeed there was a star. I believe that when it was released, though, it was very well received because it gave Kubrick the opportunity to then make films like Dr. Strangelove. In other words, it gave him the credibility, and I think audiences were deeply shaken, just as we are. One more question. We have 2 more minutes. In the back there?
It seems to me that the cynicism of Kubrick in a movie like this and the cynicism of Kubrick in Clockwork Orange are very different. In that I feel that essentially he is saying that evil, and in this movie he's saying that world injustice and evil is pretty much an outgrowth of a hierarchical, insensitive institutional structure. And there's a lot of the relation between hierarchy and sadism in the movie. And I think in Clockwork Orange, he's more of a Ronald Reagan issue, proving evil and crime, saying that it's pretty much just someone who takes a central decision whether they want to do a bad deed or not. You really, in the theme of Clockwork Orange, it's basically going against the kind of view that we're going to be lacking that crime or other manifestations of human evil are going to be related to wiring the institutional structure that people live in.
One could say, though, that these films have in common that in Clockwork Orange, at least as I read it or took it, the real villain, finally, even though, is his name Alec? What's the fellow? Alex is a hideous creature. The real villain is a totalitarian society run by people quite a bit like the officers in this film. We only see them briefly when Alex is being conditioned to prove that they can condition a criminal so that he will be harmless and can wander around society. And the triumph in the end of that movie is that Alex gets his good old energies of lust and you name it back, and the totalitarian society didn't condition him. And in that case, the kind of forces at work are the same kind of abstract hierarchical forces we have in this film that promote this kind of carnage through assigning all these strategies and responsibilities that are then shucked off on the person next level down. He certainly has a large animus against any kind of organized authority, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Kubrick? Yeah. That's only part of this movie. I think, even though that's the part easiest to talk about, the conflict between the officers and the men, or the cowardice of the officers and the gallantry of the men, etc., that shouldn't be our sole concern, because this film really is one of the great films about war. It just so happens that human beings cause war. War doesn't cause itself. And this we must never forget if we have any hope at all.
Well, on that note, I thank Terrence Des Pres very much for coming here tonight, and thank you.
Thank you.